I know, you'll have to train them. So does this turn on?
So, is there any word? Is there any? Yeah. The fire.
This is perfect for me. I said to Gary, what should I? He said, pants fit him in the same
That is quite a direct answer. I
My
almost decided pantsuit, but I'd forgotten about this dress.
So I will see you tomorrow. You'll do the religious one.
Actually, I should be able to schedule something.
So I can say goodbye tonight. That makes sense.
No, I'll be able to be there, and I think I'll be able to introduce you tomorrow morning. Rabbi Segal can set the stage for the actual stuff, but I should be able to be there if not the whole time.
Just want to get this.
Yeah. Because I'm starting the day at 9:30 and here volunteers and then as part of their classes they have the kind of the art project they're working on, putting together this thing with all of their hands, with their like favorite Jewish value words and talking about the community. Getting ready. I think I'm going to go ahead. People will sit once we start. I'm going to go ahead and start us. I think people will sit once we start. Shavua Tov. Shavua Tov, everyone. It is such a delight to join together this evening, to have had the chance to schmooze and do Havdalah, and now to continue discussing and learning together. As I begin this evening, in here I want to warmly welcome a couple local colleagues who have joined, Rabbi Andy Green, as well as Rabbi Michael Wasserman. I'm so glad. I missed Michael. Where are you now? Oh, there you are. I'm so glad that you and have joined us this evening. It means so much to have local colleagues present. And I also want to warmly welcome Dr. Andrew Rayfeld, who is in town this weekend visiting the Retired Rabbis Conference. Dr. Andrew Rayfeld is the head of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, the president of HUC JIR. And as we talk about the rabbinate and what's ahead, no pressure for Rabbi Perlin and myself to have the president of HUC with us this evening. We're so glad you're with us. And I get the pleasure again of introducing my rabbi, Amy Perlin, who has been my rabbi for longer than I can remember. She was ordained in 1982, was the first woman rabbi to start her own congregation in 1986, Temple B'nai Shalom, where I grew up. And she was one of the first women to become senior rabbi as well. And under her mentorship and influence, she has sent 9 rabbis to HUC, which is quite a feat. She also is on the board of governors of HUC and heads the Israel Committee and is deeply involved in so much of the work of our movement and in the Jewish world and what's happening right now and what lays ahead for us. So I could go on, but I think I'm going to leave it there so we can continue our conversation. So this evening, we have a chance, we have questions that we've prepared to ask each other, and we'll see where they lead us and how much we stay on these questions and how much we veer. But I wanted to start, Rabbi Perlin, by asking you about your rabbinate and the Jewish world, the rabbinic world you entered as you came into the rabbinate.
First, let me thank the wonderful people of Temple High for the warmest welcome any visitor could ever possibly receive. I know that Rabbi Segal is in such good hands because your generosity of heart and spirit is overwhelming. So I want to thank you. It's an honor to be here. I am very glad that the world you entered as a rabbi is not the world I entered as a rabbi. And as I thought about your question, when it appeared on my computer in Los Angeles, the biggest difference, I think, is that the world was going through changes. When I went to college in the early 70s, we were constantly the first women. I was one of the first women at a Ivy League school, and that had with it all sorts of changes. Professors who would say, "Gentlemen and Amy." They had admitted us, but forgot that we needed bathrooms. So I entered the rabbinate because that was the place my heart took me. But I will tell you that for me, I was entering the world where I was going to have a man's job. I don't see that happening in the generations that followed. But we were doing a man's job with the male template. And some of that was wonderful. I mean, the rabbis are great guys, all those wonderful rabbis that we quote in our tradition. But there was no template for how the rabbinate was going to adjust to us. For instance, one of my interview questions when I entered HUC was from a world-renowned scholar who said, "What are you going to do with your husband?" Stay married to him? So I don't know that the world was yet prepared. It took HUC 50 years from the time in 1922 that the vote happened, and then the professors in Cincinnati said, "No, we're not ready." So it took them 50 years to let us in. And I think now that there's been another 50 years, the world has changed. But it was not a world that was ready for women or mothers. So it was a very different world. But for those who were around in the 70s and early 80s, it was a world where feminism was transforming all of American society. And it wasn't just among Jews, it was among the Christian community as well. So we were living through a transition, and in that respect, it was exciting because you didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Would we get a job? Interestingly enough, I don't think my being a woman kept me from getting my first job. But I did have an interview where somebody walked in from a Midwestern congregation and said, "You're too short for my bima," and walked out. But there is divine justice, because then I built my own synagogue, and my bima is perfect for me.
Did you have any role models or influences that helped you believe that you could become a rabbi?
Maybe that's the saddest thing to say, is that I had no role models, none. And many women professionals who went into other professions. My college roommate became a physician in New York, and my other college roommate became a banker in San Francisco. I don't know that there were a lot of role models for women who were breaking barriers in that time. I had one person who believed in me, and that was my husband, Gary. And if not for his support, when we entered HUC said to us, "We cannot guarantee that there will be employment when you are ordained? And I said to Gary, because I was originally going to go to medical school, and I said to Gary, well, what do we do? And he said, we're going to go for it. And every step of the way, he was there and with me. So it's very simple. Without his love and support every day of my life, I don't know that I could have done this.
How has your experience and perhaps any obstacles you feel like you've faced or had to surmount, how has that shaped your role now as a mentor to rabbis and someone who brings up rabbis?
Oh, I use all of my experience to transform the experience. I hope that you feel that you have always had a role model, not just the girls in our congregation who became rabbis, but the boys as well. I don't think you need a same gender role model. What I've tried to do is to share with all of our people the privilege and the joy and the magnificence of what it means to be a rabbi and to serve the Jewish people every day. And just by living my values and teaching them and being there as an educator as well as a rabbi, I hope I've given other people what I didn't receive. I also am there for rabbis as a mentor now, and the rabbinate is very difficult. There are so many challenges now, and so I spend a lot of time doing a lot of listening. The tradition tells us we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should listen twice as much as we speak. And there aren't enough people listening to colleagues, and so I spend a lot of time listening.
Well, as a colleague, I'm grateful to you for that. And I certainly was very lucky to always have quite the role model. The world I grew up in was a world where the rabbi was a woman. Of course, women can be rabbis. And it wasn't really a joke that, with often the song leader at our home congregation when I was growing up was also a woman. And so we would have to tell little boys, like, you can come up on the bima too, you could song lead, you could be a rabbi. So the paradigm I grew up in, until I realized the broader Jewish world, was this paradigm, and it's something I'm so grateful for. Not just the paradigm, but of course, your influence and the presence you bring specifically.
The one thing that I would say is of all the demographic groups when I first became a rabbi, that were the most supportive and that I channel now, I served an elderly congregation in Sag Harbor, New York, where the average age was 80. And they were the most supportive, loving community, men and women. The first service I gave a sermon, they kind of nodded and fell asleep and whatever, and I didn't know what was going on, and the next week they were all animated and shaking their heads and listening, and I said, what's the difference? It's the same me. And they said, oh, everybody said they should put their hearing aids in. And after that, we were fast friends. They all came to my ordination, and they said they had seen a man on the moon, so a woman rabbi wasn't such a big deal. But I really appreciated that because they were my grandparents' age. I was 25 years old when I was ordained, and they were so loving and so wonderful. So you never know when you can mentor a rabbi and change someone's existence. I stand in awe of everything that you do, Rabbi Segal. I have watched how you've interacted and how you've become a part of this community in such a short time. And you're living in this media age, this post-COVID age. The world has dramatically changed. How has the cell phone, media, Zoom, Fireside chat on the Bima, I just keep thinking, what would my bubby say? It was just, how has that shaped your rabbinate and transformed the rabbinate for you?
Well, I came into a rabbinate that didn't include the degree of technology now that it does because of COVID and living through COVID in this multi-access world we're now occupying. But social media was in full swing. I was ordained in 2010, so social media was in full swing, cell phones. So it was the world I entered. And I actually sometimes wonder to myself, in the land before cell phones and social media and email and online resources, what the rabbinate must have been like and felt like, because it's the only rabbinate I know. And by and large, I think the influence of the internet and parts of social media have been a really positive thing in my rabbinate and something I've appreciated, because there are additional ways to connect. And be present with people and reach people and be available. Of course, there are pitfalls to the social media, internet age, but by and large, some rabbis have policies. They're not friends with any congregants on Facebook, and I certainly respect everyone's making choices that are comfortable for them, but from the jump I decided that there was one me, not a rabbinic me and then the separate Emily, but I'm one integrated person. And so I wanted to open up my life and connect with congregants, with community members on Facebook, and that meant that, if my kids did something ridiculous and I vented on Facebook, then I'd probably hear about it at Oneg on Friday evening. But it also meant that I could connect differently over all sorts of different things we might not have come to, and it still does mean that. There's certainly a difference, I imagine, in terms of the constant availability and people's expectations of instantaneous response and constant availability that's not limited to rabbis, of course. And I think about how powerful Shabbat is nowadays, whether it's on Shabbat itself or the concept of Shabbat, to be able to really step back from being on and the constant availability, not just for me, but for all of us. And so I think personally it's meant careful planfulness around how will I find respite and space in terms of constant availability. But it also means that we get to dig into that together in terms of these modern lives where we're pulled in so many directions. I also think that, well, clearly, as we referenced this morning, for those who were with us this morning, so many people have access now to services, to what we do, who for so many reasons before the pandemic didn't have access. It's hard to drive at night. They're ailing, they have young children. Perhaps they are someone who feels that they look like someone who's not the traditional person you'd encounter in a synagogue. And they're worried about stepping through the doors. How will they be perceived? Will they be welcomed? Well, they can meet us online, and they can establish connections online. And so being able to use those moments and foster those connections has been really special. And then, of course, leads to the question, then how do we translate that to in-person and not only connecting online? But by and large, some people, I would say, kind of schreie Gewalt about social media age and cell phones. And I have a different soapbox about certain aspects of social media, but for my rabbinate and for us, I think by and large it's been a positive because it's an opportunity for connection and relationship.
So as the rabbi scholar, you grew up in a world where you were taught we are the people of the book. And I had a lovely conversation with Cantor Feller earlier about the fact that we're really now becoming the people of the Kindle and the people of the internet search. How do you access your Judaism, and how are you teaching others to access theirs?
I would say through all of the modalities. I am a believer in, I love a physical book. I want to hold it in my hands. I want the physical experience of reading a book. I want to write notes in the margins and then later go back and say to myself, what on earth was I thinking with that note in that margin at that time? So I love a physical book and interacting, and I find text learning, for me, much more effective from the physical page with Hebrew. But I think one of the most transformative think that the biggest transformations that have happened around Jewish text learning is the website Sefaria. For those who aren't familiar, if you've seen my text sheets, usually they're on Safari if you've studied with me thus far. But it's this wonderful online resource that has text from throughout the ages that you can link from one verse and see what different scholars said over time. So the conversation across the ages that we might find on the page of the Talmud is represented in this incredible resource online with different translations. And so that's transformed how I prepare to teach and sometimes how I study. So I think that for me, I encourage and I engage in the Luddite in me, loves a book. But I would encourage also finding online ways of engaging. There are chavrutas, there are study partners meeting over Zoom, right? We're no longer limited by location. And I've had incredible study opportunities via Zoom with colleagues and with other people. And so I think taking advantage of all of our resources nowadays is what I encourage, what I practice. And I'm eager to see how it all develops over time.
So it's not on our list of questions, but I want to ask a follow-up. Jewish education is going through a major transformation since COVID and also because of technology. The attention span of young people is being written up by all these educators. How do you see your role in shaping Jewish education of the future, given that our young people spend most of their lives with their thumbs?
What I would say is that I'm a believer in experiential education and immersive education. I don't think that, for instance, Jewish summer camp, kids get amazing Jewish education and education through experience at our summer camps. I know that was transformative. Just one summer of Jewish summer camp, and a few weeks later I declared I wanted to be a rabbi. It worked its magic. My husband had transformative experiences at Jewish summer camp. Our kids have started to go. So immersive experiences, I think, are really important and powerful. And I would say that I encourage and believe in a mix of integrating technology into the classroom because it is like an extra appendage for our young people. It's natural to them. And having technology work for us and project-based learning in the classroom. But I also am a big believer in creating spaces where kids have the opportunity to step back from just using their thumbs. One of the most powerful things at Jewish summer camp is that the kids don't have their cell phones. They don't have their devices. And somehow they manage to survive. And in fact, that's part of the magic because they don't have divided attention between the device and the person before them and the community before them. So I think planfully creating those spaces. I recently read an article about a movement among younger people, teenagers, early college students, a Luddite movement. They want flip phones, they don't want the same apps all the time, of using not so old school, like from early 2000s, cameras instead of the camera on their phones. And I'm very interested to see about the pendulum. Will the pendulum swing differently for technology and how we interact with it as well? So I think nimble is one of the ways we need to be, as well as using all of the tools in our toolbox, both having technology work with us, but also creating sacred space by stepping away from divided attention.
For me, my phone is just a camera. I have 80,000 pictures of my grandchildren. But if you call it, it says, I'm not going to answer, so call Gary. I guess it's generational.
So circling back to some of what you shared, Rabbi Perlin, about your experience coming in, not only into the rabbinate, but in college and the path you have walked in your rabbinate. One question when we talk about women coming into a man's role or into a man's world, I haven't heard it as much lately, but there was a period of time when we talked about the feminization of the rabbinate, right? And I always wondered, is that just that there are more female rabbis? Is that what we mean? Or is it changing some essence of the rabbinate? Are women bringing something special? And so a question I have for you, especially as the percentage of women in the rabbinate has grown so exponentially since 1972, HUC has ordained something like 865 or more women rabbis since 1972, which is incredible. How do you think women rabbis, do you think, and if so, how do you think women rabbis have changed Judaism and changed the rabbinate?
I think there are many sociologists in the Jewish community who've addressed this issue. I look to my older male colleagues for the answer, because they're the ones who taught me what changes we were making. I didn't even realize we were making changes. In so many ways, many in the generations before us had to make a choice between the grueling hours of the rabbinate and their families. And none of us were willing to make that compromise. And so part of what you would call the feminization of the rabbinate was saying, I'm a whole being, I'm a wife and a mother, and I need to incorporate that into this crazy life of the rabbi. I think it benefited my contemporary male colleagues as much as it benefited us. In fact, in some ways, they say more so, because it empowered them to be the dads they wanted to be and to make sure. I remember one of the greatest rabbis in America, I won't name him, I was a former president of the CCR, came to speak to us in rabbinical school, and he said, I do not eat Shabbat dinner with my family. At 5 o'clock, I go to temple, and I prepare for the weekend, and my heart broke. And I came home from HUC that day, and I said to Gary, from this moment forward, we don't have kids yet, we will have Shabbat dinner every Friday. And we did. And the same Shabbat rituals that we had then, we have now, and our children have them at their homes, and we have them with our grandchildren. So I think there was an empowerment of the family. I also believe that in many respects, we gave the movement permission to be creative. If you think about your grandfather's or great-grandfather's talit, and I have a little subspecialty in identifying talitot and when they're from. When I went to buy my first talit, I didn't want that blue and white silk one with the fringes that got all cruddy at the end because they got stuck in the zipper of the bag. I wanted something a little bit different, and I went out to Long Island to this suburban bookstore, and the guy said, well, I just got in this purple thing. And I bought my first talit, which was wool, which is too heavy for a talit most of the year, but it was lavender and beige. And I decided I would needlepoint a talit bag, which had never really been done before. There was no template, and I wanted to needlepoint, and I was so busy with my studies and working 3 jobs to put myself through school. And Professor Orlinsky, who translated the Torah as we know it, said Nelson Glick's wife needlepointed all through every meeting of HUC, and so we could needlepoint in class. And so I still have that talit bag, and every time I look at the stitches, I think of Dr. Orlinsky. May he rest in peace. And I can remember every lesson with every stitch. So I think there was a boom in Jewish art, the empowerment to change ritual objects. If you look at the history of ritual objects, whether it's the Skirball Museum or the museum in New York, the Jewish Museum, you'll see that as well. And the change in liturgy. And I'll be honest, I was kind of an old fuddy-duddy, but there were parts of the liturgy that I felt I fought for. So for instance, we sing Misha Berach now in the congregation. Misha Berach never appeared in a prayer book. It was part of my rabbinic thesis. The Misha Berach was said by the rabbi in the Torah service, and it was in a rabbi's manual. It was never available to the average Jew. And I'm sitting there as a really young person saying, this healing prayer needs to be in the hands of all the people. Simultaneously, in another part of the country, Debbie Friedman is writing the Mishaberach prayer. But we were taught in my day in rabbinical school, and I hope we still do push it, to know the traditional Mishaberach, because you should know both. But I really felt it needed to be in a prayer book accessible, and it wasn't. And I kept going to the movement and saying, the people need the healing prayer. So we pasted it in the back of all of our prayer books. And we were one of the first congregations in America to say the Mishaberach at every service. And then when the new Mishkan Tefillah was coming out, there was a debate, should it be in or shouldn't it? And it was one of the few times I stood up and said, if we have a prayer book without the Mishaberach in it, it would be a travesty for humanity. Because healing is such an important part of what it means for us as human beings. So I think in so many ways, many of us wanted the entire being to be part of the Jewish experience, not just the head, but the heart and the physical being. And I think women rabbis had the courage to make some changes that others also made. But I would give credit to my male colleagues as well. Many of them were ready for those changes and joined us.
And what you were sharing about Mishaberach reminded me, I remember a service, I can't say how old I was, you might know what year it would have been, when we were still using gates of blue, not the gender-neutral gates of gray, and when we were exploring God language. And at the beginning of the service, you said that we were going to try out she instead of he. And I think you said anytime it said Lord, we would just say God. And then after the service, to talk about it. When I remember, looking at my dad sitting next to me. It was great for me.
It wasn't great for me.
But it was but I, now reflecting back on that, you created a container to experiment with that language for people to have their experience of it and to be in conversation. I hadn't thought of it in that way until you said it wasn't a great evening for you. I can imagine that now, sitting where I sit, that would be a challenge, but here I am remembering that all these years later, that specific service, and where I can think of where I was sitting in the sanctuary, looking up at the bima as you shared that.
I spent over a decade studying change management for that very reason, because sometimes you want to bring new things to people, and the language you choose and the modality you choose makes all the difference in the world. The other big change, I would say, and then we can move on to our next question, is when I was ordained, there was no maternity leave. No maternity leave. Can you imagine? The expectation was you'd have the baby and be back to work the next day. And so there was no pay equity. I got a call from the CCAR saying, you're the lowest paid assistant in America. Yeah. And the reason is that every time I was up for a pay raise, the finance committee would come to me and say, the rabbi has 3 children in college, and you have a husband who makes a good living. So we really only have so much money we can give for a raise, and we really need to give it to the rabbi. So I think that you are part of the change in all your work as a co-president of the WRN in making sure maternity leave and pay equity and all of those things are now part of our world.
Yeah, that's one of the important things that I feel really glad to have been able to work on as part of WRN. I'm currently co-president of the Women's Rabbinic Network, and one of the things that we did, we actually completed it early in the pandemic, was created a resource document on paid family and medical leave, not just for rabbis and not just for women, but for all Jewish professionals, suggesting a baseline standard, policy, language, and now the WRN is working on the inevitable first question almost every congregation asks, because usually nowadays they say, we would love to do this, how do we pay for it? And so that's the next step that we're beginning to work on, resources and ideas and pooling resources. So that's been something I feel really proud of being able to be part of that work in the creation of the document that I know it's been wonderful to hear has been so helpful to people so far.
Your rabbi is transforming the rabbinate, and she's so humble about it. But when I see the documents that come forth in her administration, I am so incredibly proud.
Thank you. Would you say that our focus on women rabbis, women in the rabbinate, is of this moment, or do you think perhaps it is outdated?
So I'm going to answer this question. I'm not sure you're going to like my answer. When I started out, we had a Women's Rabbinic Alliance, which became the Women's Rabbinic Network. And I went faithfully for many years until there were more single women than women who were married with children, and we were sort of marginalized, and I sort of disappeared for a while, and then I came back because of the revitalization of the WRN. But I do think that women still need a place. I am not thrilled, as you know, with the fact that with all of the new gender identity, we're not an exclusively women's group anymore. I think that opening the group up to, and you can explain that, to other people takes away from the fact that there should still be men's groups and there should still be women's groups. Their affinity groups don't have to disappear because we're living in this changing world. What I don't think is necessary anymore is talking about how special being a woman rabbi is. You know, I remember in my first year out in the congregation, I was in Washington, the suburb of Washington, D.C., and one of the congregants came up to me and said, "You know what I decided? Being a woman rabbi is like being a panda at the National Zoo." So I don't think you're my first. You know, everybody would come up and say, "You're my first," and I don't think we're dealing with that kind of world anymore. So I think there is a transformation. But in all honesty, we haven't gotten there yet. Dr. Rayfeld will tell you that we have many rabbis on the HUC board, and up until last year, I was the only woman. So we still have a long way to go. The oldest too, but the only woman.
And I'll share, as Rabbi Perlin referenced, the WRN recently, just this past spring, we had a whole process of learning, first as the WRN board, around gender and gender identity, and not even the spectrum, the real web of identities around gender that we understand now not only exist, but that we celebrate. So to share common language and learning about this, and then we brought it to the whole organization with a question of whether to officially welcome non-binary and gender-fluid rabbis into the Women's Rabbinic Network as well. And this was something that was a very difficult, talk about change management. I was glad that that was something I dug into in fellowships and in learning going into this process. It was a very difficult process, speaking across different knowledge, different generations in the rabbit, different experiences, people on each side of the question who felt very strongly and deeply about preserving, out of goodness, preserving the preciousness of WRN and that really sacred space that we create, and others who felt that if we didn't make the move, we would be going against their Jewish values and they no longer want to be part of our organization. In the end, we did vote overwhelmingly to admit non-binary and gender-fluid rabbis into the WRN, knowing that we already have them in our ranks, people who had gone through processes over time and now identified as non-binary. But it was a very interesting and I think healthy process, but a difficult one. And we will see. We don't even know if non-binary and gender-fluid rabbis particularly want to be part of the WRN, but we wanted them to have access to the space and the resources in that way. But the next step is, of course, how do we truly welcome them, and what does that mean for what we do?
So as a rabbi in 2023, you're dealing with issues that we never dreamed of dealing with. Could you discuss some of the gender and other issues that really are unique to your generation?
Yeah, so around gender, I certainly agree with you on the question, that I posed to you about talking about women in the rabbinate. I don't think it's outdated to do so. We still have quite a distance to go. There still are gaps in pay equity. I think women are making something like 82%, 82 cents on the dollar compared to men still in the rabbinate. We're not talking individual cases, and there are different ways to crunch the numbers, but across the board. And that's even more stark among educators and other Jewish professionals. And issues of pay equity, of course, connect to issues around family leave and so many other issues. So, and also around issues such as microaggressions and not so microaggressions that women and others in the rabbinate who are traditionally discriminated against due to gender certainly face. So it's not outdated. I kind of wish it were outdated, except that I've experienced such special camaraderie and relationship and space with my women colleagues and value that so much, and it's so precious to me. In terms of other issues that in this moment rabbis are facing, rabbis of my generation and congregations are facing, there are, of course, a number, and we touched on some of them, of course, this morning. And I have been thinking of this, thinking of this question. Some of these questions that we wrote, as I reflected, I said, oh, we wrote these questions, and now I have to answer them. And I've been thinking of this question in relationship to balancing priorities and the push and pull of different priorities and important ones. So one of the key issues that I think rabbis and congregations now are facing is, and we did touch on this morning with a wonderful question someone asked about how do we adapt and innovate and change to meet the needs of people who are not currently served by our congregations, seeking out the people who have not yet affiliated or who aren't Jewishly engaged yet, and helping them find that spark of being part of Jewish community. How do we engage them? And also, how do we not lose sight of continuing to bring meaning to people who are currently so well served by our congregations, right? That takes time and energy and resources. And sometimes the needs are the same, sometimes the needs are different, and when they differ, how do we expand to meet those needs? So I think that's one of the major challenges, particularly in this moment of transformation in the Jewish community, is the way people are coming together is shifting. So that's one priority balance, that I think is a major issue. Another major issue is how divisive conversation in our country, and not just in our country, but in our country is. We, in so many ways, seem to have lost the ability to have important discussions with one another unless we agree on every single point. And if we can't have discussions where we disagree, how can we talk about anything of import? And we have to talk about the important things, or else how are we relevant? What are we even doing if we can't talk to each other and disagree, and then not convince each other, but come to a place of greater understanding that another person can bring, and different wisdom? When we have a tradition that says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, that diametrically oppose things, these and these are the words of the living God, not just the teachings of the rabbis, but the words of the living God. If Talmud can say that, and we can't talk about healthcare, we can't talk about Israel, and we have to. So I think that's one of the major challenges, and of course not only facing rabbis, but from the bima in teaching and in conversations, we have to find ways to talk to each other and ways to create communities where we can have very much differing opinions, and then we can have challah together. We can sit together at oneg. We can be present for each other in times of challenge and in times of joy and be in community. We have to be able to do that. And there's some people doing some pretty powerful work around that. I don't know if you've encountered our colleague, Rabbi Rachel Schmelkin. Rabbi Rachel Schmelkin was the associate rabbi educator in Charlottesville, Virginia, a number of years ago at Congregation Beth Israel in Charlottesville, Virginia. My alma mater is the University of Virginia, so I taught Sunday school there. I worked at the summer camp there and the preschool, so it's a place near and dear to my heart. And she was, even more than her senior colleague, was very present with everything that was happening in Charlottesville, and has now begun to work as the faith coordinator for the One America movement, which is an organization working to help bring people the tools to talk to each other when you differ on very important topics. I recently did a fellowship program. I entered a fellowship program with them because this is so important for us to work on. So that's another major issue. There are a lot of them. I could keep going. Those are two major issues.
Thank you. As you look at the longevity of your career, what do you see the challenges over the next 5 years to the next decade are for rabbis, especially pulpit rabbis? What are you hearing from your colleagues, and what are you anticipating for yourself?
So some of course, the couple of things I mentioned are among those major issues. As our congregation knows well, the question of physical space is a major question for many colleagues. For those who have historic spaces that take so much upkeep, deferred maintenance, I'm speaking a language I know you know, and what to do with synagogues that were built for a very different moment. And certainly not a moment when a big portion of our kahal, of our community, joins us online. And we may not need all the physical space, even if the same number of people are in the pews, if we count the virtual pews. So space is a major question, a major issue. I'm not a believer, and the people in the congregation know this. I said this as I was getting to know the congregation. I'm not a believer in, by and large, the model of congregations without walls. We need a house to make a home. We need a place to let the kids run around like Vildachayas, like they own the place, and to break bread together and be present together. And so needing space, you said it this morning, we need right-sized spaces, and we also need them to be very flexible and technologically savvy, which is a challenge when you never know what 5 years down the line technology is going to look like. So space is a major challenge not only for us, but for faith communities, not just synagogues. And I would say that as you raised toward the beginning of our time around social media and online presence and post-pandemic, finding ways to, some people have moved to Zoom and streaming and need to stay there for health reasons. It's not safe for them to be in our sanctuaries. The people it's given access to who don't have the physical capability to join us. But there are others whose habits changed and who haven't come back in. So re-engaging folks who, I'm not going to say disengaged, but found different ways to engage, but haven't been present physically with us as much is one. And also how do we, another balancing of priorities, how do we make sure that multi-access doesn't mean a diminished experience through each access point, but elevating all of them. So those are additional challenges.
So I have lots of expectations for you, you know that. And one of them is that you will raise up the next generation of rabbis and cantors and Jewish professionals and educators. What advice would you give to somebody seeking a Jewish professional life today? How are you going to mentor the next generation of Jewish leaders?
Well, I'll say one of the things that I so appreciate about what I've experienced from you and what you've shared today about what you say and how you embody the mentorship is to share what is incredible and magical and affirming and a true blessing about the work that we get to do. There are times when I've encountered many times rabbis in the field, when they encounter someone who wants to be a rabbi or just entered rabbinic school and they say, get out now, they think they're joking, but it scares people. And I always say, it's hard. It's really hard, and you have to really want it. And just like in any big job, there are compromises you make about your life, but it's magic. It is the best job on earth. Tough, but one of the best jobs on earth, and we get to be present with people, Jewish educators as well, in these amazing moments, and God willing, transform people's lives, and it's a blessing. So that's a perspective that you always shared with me and continue to, and that I always try to bring as well. I don't want to scare anyone off. I want to say, join this amazing community of Jewish professionals. And in terms of advice that I would give and do give for rabbinic students if they're coming in or anything like that, one of the key things I always say is study as much as you can now. Enjoy studying now. I know the syllabi are intensely overwhelming. They were to me too, but you're never going to have the focused time to study like that again in your career, and you'll be desperate for it. So just soak it in. And I also say, make sure your Hebrew as best as it possibly can be, because you need access to these texts and to give people access in Hebrew and in Aramaic. So text skills, and just to soak in and enjoy all of that study. Because if I could go back and just study all of it again, not with HUC tuition, for free, I would do it.
We're working on free. We'll get there.
I've heard that. That's
we'll
exciting.
get there. I think we're coming to a close, and I don't think we need to ask me any more questions. Do you? So last night, as part of the installation, I put in there that to cherish the values you were taught and the ones you hold dear. One of the things that I'm working on now is there's a lot of confusion as to what are Jewish values and what are personal values. And just because a Jew holds a value doesn't make it Jewish. And yet I'm sitting in meetings where people are espousing values that I know are contrary to Jewish tradition. And it's incredibly frustrating. And depending on where you are in the country or which shul you're at, the Jewish values change. But this is your community, and you have been installed as the senior rabbi. So I think it would be beautiful and fitting to end with the values in your heart and the values that you believe will ground your future here at Temple Chai.
Oh, I love that question.
It wasn't on the list.
I would say first and foremost, I'm coming back, and I'll explain exactly what I mean. I'm coming back to kahila, the word that was on the Torah that David Weiner placed into my arms yesterday evening, and kahila kadosha. And what I mean by that is being truly present for one another in relationship and in community. And in relationship, I'm imagining Martin Buber's I Thou, that deep connection that isn't only superficial, but recognizing the humanity in each person we're encountering in community, and caring community, which is already so important, so core here at Temple Chai, caring for one another in moments of challenge and being present in moments of joy. So that is the value that first and foremost comes to mind. And while I don't have the perfect Hebrew words, if I were encapsulating the value, that we have always, Judaism has always been in development. We are constantly under construction. And Temple Chai already recognizes that experimentation with prayer lab, with trying new things, even if they're zany, with learning in different ways, engaging deeply. And what I would say is the Jewish value of constantly turning and turning and turning again Torah and the way we come together and finding new meaning, beautiful meaning, deeper meaning, that is the eternal relevance of our tradition. And so that is also what I know will continue to ground us as we are under construction in our whole Jewish lives and may soon be under construction one way or another physically as well as a congregation.
So I'm going to offer some conclusion. There's a 4th century rabbinic text that many people know, and there's a tiny little phrase in there from Pirkei Avot that says, Aseh lecha rav. Make for yourself a rabbi, in the crudest translation. I think it's really important as a community to understand that a rabbi comes into a community with an education and life experience and a desire to serve and to love. But each one of you will make your rabbi. It's a partnership. It's a covenant. And that covenant is sacred. You've heard your rabbi. She's willing to agree to disagree. She's embracing this community, and she's willing to embrace change and experience things that shouldn't change. But Aseh lecha rav. Make the experience with your rabbi yours. It's a partnership. Call her. Talk to her. Invite her for coffee. Tell her good things. You know, I have a policy. You say 3 compliments before you do 1 criticism. And then the criticism is taken better because then they know that it's not really a criticism. It's an investment in the other person's being. So my best advice is to take that value that the rabbis of old gave us and Aseh lecha rav. For me, as a rabbi, I took it in a different way. Make for yourself rabbis. And I did. And you are the beneficiary of one of the greatest rabbis that was ever created in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
I want to express gratitude again to all of you for being present, to Rabbi Perlin for your wisdom and your perspective. I could just sit here and talk with you.
It's getting hot.
Whew, it's getting too Right. I feel like this fireside chats may have to become a thing here. I'm loving this. And I love your beautiful conclusion, and I have to add, so the rest of the phrase, Aseh lecha rav, uknei lecha chaver, v'dan et kol ha'adam l'chaf zechut. So, and that is so meaningful to me in this moment as we sit here. Aseh lecha rav, make for yourself, find for yourself a rabbi, who I have in my rabbi. Acquire for yourself a friend. And judge each person by the best that is in them. And that is something that you so embody in your rabbinate, finding the aspects of each of us to love, and something you taught me. So you have, for me, embodied all 3 parts of that beautiful phrase from Pirkei Avot. I'm grateful to you. Thank you for being here, and thanks to all of you. Shavua Tov. And Torah study with Rabbi Perlin tomorrow at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. Torah study. Thank you again. Shavua Tov.